huge amounts of debt.
So you think it was some kind of natural occurrence?
It happens all the time, George. You have to be...
Don't keep saying that, David. It doesn't happen all the time.
It's called the economic
When was the
cycle.
last
It
time?
happens all the time.
When was the last time virtually all of the main banks in Britain failed?
We are not talking about banks.
I'm talking about banks.
Yeah.
You're saying that it was a natural cyclical occurrence. But the reason for the silence when I asked you that question is because the answer is never. There has never been a time in Britain or anywhere else where almost all of the major banks failed.
George, there will be bubbles happening in the economy all the time. In the year 2000, we had the dot-com bubble, right? Now, that actually sort of brought down much of the stock market. It brought down much of the technology world, and it very nearly sort of brought down a whole world collapse. Had it not been for the fact that...
No, dot-coms can't bring about a sort of world collapse. It's banks collapsing that almost brought the entire economy down. And they collapsed because of the greed of the people working in them. And there's another big difference with the dot-com bubble. The taxpayer wasn't asked to spend hundreds of billions of pounds to rescue lastminute.com or any other .com. But we were forced to spend hundreds of billions of pounds rescuing your pals, the bankers, and now you tell us it was some kind of natural cyclical event that Gordon Brown ought to have laid money aside in order to bail them out.
Well, George, of course he should have done. You cannot continue to run a budget deficit and expect people to carry on bailing you out all the time.
But it's not our fault that we've got a budget deficit. It's
whose fault is it then, George?
The bankers' fault that we've got a budget deficit.
No, for goodness sake, George, I mean, this budget deficit has been going on since the year 2002. So between 2002 and 2007, we were running a budget deficit.
But we've run a budget deficit almost every year in the history of the modern British state. Why are you pretending to people that this was somehow a unique occurrence? All countries run a budget deficit. Tell me one country that doesn't have a budget deficit.
George, the budget deficit...
Can you answer that, David, please?
Right, George, listen...
David, can you answer that question? Tell me one country that doesn't have a budget deficit.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong isn't a country.
I beg to differ, George.
No, you beg to differ?
Yes, I do, George.
Hong Kong is a part of the People's Republic of China.
It is a special administrative zone, but that is something completely different, George.
It is not a country. Tell me a country that doesn't have a budget deficit.
Singapore does not have a budget deficit.
Singapore is a city.
George, Singapore, the Republic of Singapore is a country. But let's get away from semantics, George. What you need to do, right, if you are running a country, you need to ensure that you do not spend more than you actually collect in terms of tax revenue.
Look, please, save me the Grantham grocer shop homilies, because you know very well, if you know anything about economics, that countries are not the same as grocery stores. If they were, there would be no state. We'd be, as I said, like Somalia. Now, last question, because I don't have time to argue with you any longer. I'm grateful for the time you've given us. You say that the 500,000 public sector jobs that are about to be shed will be able to be absorbed into the private sector. You appear to have missed the PricewaterhouseCoopers prediction just last week that those 500,000 public sector job losses are going to cause another 500,000 private sector job losses for the obvious fact that the wages of that 500,000 will not be spent on the goods and services provided by the second 500,000.
Well, let's wind the clock back a little bit further, George. I mean, those 500,000 jobs should never have been created in the first place. Those 500,000 jobs should have been in the public sector. Obviously, when you take away the 500,000 jobs, it's a lot more difficult than never having created those jobs in the first place. So what really has to happen now is what they call the rebalancing of the economy to ensure that the private sector takes up the slack from the public sector. The big challenge for the private sector is whether or not they can create those 500,000 jobs in order to absorb these people. The only way that will happen, George, is if right, is if the economy is allowed to grow. And this is really sort of the most crucial point. How is the economy going to grow, and how is private enterprise going to actually sort of take up this slack? The only way you can do it, George, is to actually reduce the taxes, not increase the taxes by increasing the burden on the public, on the private sector.
So, and then we'll be starting to cut still more public services because we don't have the tax revenue to pay for them.
Well, that really depends.
You really don't believe in having public services, do you?
Yeah, of course I do, George, because I think there are some things, that will never be provided by the private sector because there is no money in it. So therefore, those are the areas that you actually have to use taxes in order to finance. But apart from that, there are lots of other areas where you can do perfectly well with the private sector that you don't have to actually look at the public sector in order to do it. So by shrinking the public sector, you'll be able to sort of create more jobs in the private sector. And I think it is probably more satisfying for people to work in the private sector than to work in the public sector, because ultimately, when you work in the public sector, you are being answerable to people like ourselves, the taxpayers.
David, you've been a good sport. Thanks for joining us.
You're
David
welcome,
Kuo,
George.
Director at Motley Fool. Oh, and we're late with the news. I'll be in trouble.